Chapter 14, Agriculture and Food Resources. In this chapter, we're going to talk for a few minutes about some of the problems that are facing the world when it comes to food. We'll talk about the challenges of modern agriculture and how to address some of those problems. And then we'll talk about pests and pesticides before we wrap things up. So when you look at global hunger, we talked about growing global populations back in Chapter 7 and how one of the largest issues with the growing global population was poverty. And where you have poverty, you typically have hunger. People can't afford to purchase the food that they need. There's almost 1 billion people in this world who lack food to lead a healthy, productive life. And what that simply means is someone who is capable of doing and putting in a day's work. For example, if you are intensely hungry or chronically hungry, you don't have the energy to do those types of things. Most of these people are found in rural areas of the very poorest developing countries. And a lot of them are children. As a matter of fact, we have almost 182 million children who are suffering from undernutrition. Undernutrition is simply a type of malnutrition where you're not eating enough calories, or the calories that you are eating are void of the things that you need, the protein, the vitamins, the minerals. So think of diets that are principally made up of rice, for example. If you eat rice and broth 3 times a day, you might be getting the calories that you need, but you're not actually getting the nutrients that you require, and it leaves your body weak and susceptible to disease. Alternately, another food problem happens in the developed world, and this is called overnutrition. Quite simply, this means people eat too many calories, and it has a similar effect. It leaves their bodies susceptible to disease. So a typical American diet, if you want to think of it that way, high in saturated fats and sugar and salt, it results in a whole host of health problems. And again, this is something that is unique to highly developed nations where we have relatively inexpensive, cheap food. And that cheap food isn't always very good for us. And so what we see is typically some of the same groups, those poor populations, minority populations, are the ones who are most at risk for developing these types of problems, diabetes and heart disease, because while they do have money to buy food, they aren't buying the types of nutritious food that they need in order to maintain, again, those healthy, productive lifestyles. So we consider about 86 countries food deficient. What it simply means is that they can't make enough of their own food and they can't afford to bring it in. So we know that hunger, population, poverty, and environmental problems, they're all related to each other. And we kind of talked this back in the population chapter, and essentially one of the ways to curb this, if you remember, was to, promote women, was to provide them with education and things like that. That'll help to control population growth, which also will help to, in that case, promote economic development of women and things like that. So that's the bad news. The good news is that we are producing more food than we ever have produced before. So we've been doubling grain production ever since the 1970s. The problem is that the population is growing too fast for farmers to keep up with it. So over the next 15 to 20 years, we'll need to grow 30% more food just to be able to feed the number of people we have on this planet, and it's a difficult thing to do. There's 2 types of agriculture when we're talking about agriculture, the difference between developed countries and developing countries, industrialized versus subsistence. Industrialized agriculture is what we do here, and what it is you have not as much land, but you have large energy inputs and large capital inputs. What that simply means is you put a lot of money into seed and fertilizer and pest control and all of that kind of stuff to grow some type of monoculture crop, corn or soy or wheat, whatever it happens to be. We can get really big yields from that, which is fantastic. to feed people, but we're putting in a lot of energy to do that. If you compare that to developing countries, what we're looking there is what's called subsistence agriculture. And what essentially they do is they have just enough land to raise food for themselves and their family to eat, and that's it. They don't have the fertilizer inputs. They don't have the water inputs. They don't have the type of inputs that we see in modern agriculture. So what happens is the land that they're farming very quickly runs out of nutrients, and they have to move on to another piece of land. So this particular graphic just shows all the different inputs that we need in order to grow a crop, typically using industrialized agriculture. So what are the challenges we're facing? Our next big point is looking at the amount of farmland we have. We can grow more food on less land, which is great. But the problem is we're losing farmland. We're losing varieties of crops. We also have to address all of the environmental impacts. Farms are being the victim of urbanization and suburban sprawl. So just like we talked about earlier when we were talking about sustainability and how we were trying to concentrate growth so that we don't sprawl out and eat up all this green space. Well, another thing we don't want to eat up is the farmland. It's very common, especially in our area in Chicago, go west of the suburbs or go south of the suburbs, and it won't be too long until you run into farmland. Most of Illinois is covered in farmland. We're a prime farming state, but we see that new development continues to encroach more and more and more into that farmland. So there's been some bills that that come up every year, including the Farm Bill. It gets renewed every time it's up for renewal. And what it does is it basically puts a freeze on farmland. It says, look, we'll pay you if you just keep farming your land. We, meaning the government, we'll pay you if you just keep farming your land. Don't sell it to developers. Don't sell it to anybody. Just keep farming it. And it gives them ability to do that. So we're trying to prevent some of this from happening. Again, this is a very common sight in Illinois, homes backing right up to farmland. Another challenge quickly is we're losing varieties of plants, and that might not seem that big of a deal because we just grow a few types of corn and we grow a few types of apples and a few types of this and a few types of that. But the problem is if we lose these varieties, if any type of disease comes out and wipes out an entire crop variety, that's something that we can never get back. So bananas right now are actually one of those types of crops that we're in risk of losing. The particular type of banana that we eat is susceptible to a fungal disease, and there's no way to stop it. All the bananas are clones of each other, and so all it takes is an infection in that area to spread throughout the area to kill off all the bananas. So this is something we're concerned about because we may start to lose some of these valuable crops if we're not careful about protecting and maintaining their diversity. And of course, environmental impacts. Industrialized agriculture it's dirty, for lack of a better word. We use a lot of fossil fuels. We use pesticides. We use fertilizers. It causes air pollution and water pollution. We especially see this when we have big agribusinesses versus family farms. These giant agribusinesses are basically just cattle feedlots or poultry factories, and it creates huge amounts of waste, especially animal wastes. And then, of course, the pesticides that we're using to do all this. So this is an example of one of those mega hog farms, and what you're looking at here are lagoons where they're actually dumping waste. So this is actually a manure lagoon, and that's the problem with these what we call concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs. What they do is they produce huge amounts of waste that we can't really do anything with, and we have the potential again to pollute water and other sources. So what do we do? Big point number 3, this idea that we can move to sustainable agriculture. What does sustainable agriculture mean? Well, very similar to what we've talked about with sustainability before. We're using methods that maintain the productivity and health of a farming system so that it's productive also now and also in the future. This is called low impact or alternative agriculture. You use a variety of different methods. You grow a lot of different crops rather than just one. You breed a lot of different animals rather than just one. You use water and energy conservation. You rotate your crops. You use the manure as fertilizer versus bringing in commercial fertilizers. It's not a single program. You adapt it to each situation. What you're losing is the high yields. You are not growing more and more bushels of corn or wheat or soy or whatever happens to be. You're not increasing your yields. You're sacrificing yields in order to maintain the long-term sustainability of the farm. So this is what one of these sustainable farms would look like. Again, you have lots of different crops and lots of different animals and lots of different types of landscapes, and they all work together to produce something that is easier on the environment to absorb than those traditional modern agriculture farms. What else can we do? Well, genetic engineering. What is genetic engineering? You may have heard of this as genetic modification, or we also call them GE foods or GM foods. What it is we're taking genes from one species and putting them into an unrelated species in order to get a particular trait that we're looking for. Genetic engineering is used extensively in medicine, and it's also used in agriculture. And what we want to do is we want to make plants that are more tolerant, that we don't have to spray so many pesticides, or we don't have to spray so many herbicides. We want to make them resistant to droughts or to the cold or to salt water. That's the idea. We can make plants more nutritious. This is a little graphic that tells quickly what you do. Whatever trait you're interested in, you insert it into the plant, and through some careful manipulation, you can get a plant that has a trait that it didn't have before. That's the idea. So there are some concerns, of course, about genetically modified foods. Some people are concerned about whether or not they're more allergic, or consumers would be more allergic to genetically modified foods than normal foods. That's a possibility. You never know when it comes to allergenicity. There's also discussion of what happens if these genes get out into the wild. What if they escape from the cultivated plants we have them in? What harm they could do to ecosystems. More likely than not, we're not 100% sure on either question. We believe that they are safe for consumption. There has been nothing to suggest the contrary, and they've been available for the last 20 years, and so far everything looks okay. As far as environmental concerns, again, we're not sure. We haven't had any problems as of yet. That doesn't mean that they still couldn't happen, of course. You don't want to necessarily wait for something bad to happen to find out that you shouldn't be doing something. But in this case, it seems that the increases that we're getting, the better yields, using less inputs, it seems like the benefits in general tend to outweigh the costs as far as scientific consensus is concerned. Our last thing we're going to talk about are pests and pesticides. Pesticides make up a large percentage of pollutants that we find in water, especially in our area, because we are such an agriculture-intensive state. If we're going to talk about water pollution around us, it's most likely going to come in the form of pesticides. And pesticides are anything that kills pests. Insects, rodents, funguses, other plants, you name it. Pesticides are good and bad. They can prevent disease-carrying organisms. They can protect plants from pests. But there also are problems with pesticides. Most of them kill not just the organism that we want, but they also kill a whole host of other beneficial ones, and that's a big problem. They don't degrade easily. They tend to stick around in the environment, and they become dangerous. And then, of course, we have genetic resistance to things like pesticides. Another problem with pesticides is that over time, pests develop resistance to them. And so you have to spray more and more to kill the same amount of pests as you did before because of this resistance. What can we do instead? Well, there are a whole bunch of different ways that we see that are more natural means of controlling pests. We can use predators. We can use pheromones and hormones. We can use genetic controls and quarantines. There's something called integrated pest management that uses a whole variety of methods in order to solve and tackle this problem of pests. And that's it for this lecture. Please make sure you review the rest of the notes, especially since I quickly moved over pests and pest control.